Hey everybody, so it's been a really long time since I've put up a video, and there's a lot of things that have kind of played a role in that. First of all, being COVID and the fact that my entire field season was shut down in like the span of a week. So no Arctic footage or anything like that this year. And then the second thing is I went home when that happened, filmed a bunch of stuff for you guys with Aspen, and then about like 5 days after that, my computer just went kaput. It just completely failed. All of my footage was gone, and that's it. So, and then the third thing too is I just passed my comprehensive exams for my PhD. So that's kind of the hurdle that you have to do before you can start writing your thesis. And that was a big, huge 2-month long process. So all of that is done, and hopefully I can get back on board with filming things and putting things up more regularly. Anyways, so today I thought that we could talk a little bit about something that I get questions about a lot, and that is whether or not spaying your dog is a good choice. I feel like a lot of people talk about the pros for spays, and a lot of emphasis is put on the reproductive part of spaying. Of course, spaying your dog will stop them from having puppies, but I want to focus on the pros and cons. A lot of times vets won't give you cons. I'm going to give you published studies, things that are peer-reviewed. I don't look at anything that's not peer-reviewed just because I am a scientist. That's just not what I do. I'm going to assume you guys are responsible owners. You're not allowing your females that are intact to run around free and breed with any dog that they come into contact with. It's really quite simple to make sure that your dog doesn't become pregnant if they are an intact female. So let's put the reproductive aspect of spaying aside, and let's just focus on pros and cons health-wise and when it comes to behavior as well. So first and foremost, what is a spay? A lot of people don't understand what a spay is. So normally here, at least in Canada and the US, the ovaries and the uterus are removed. So that basically removes the source of estrogen and progesterone for the animal. So the first and the most obvious pro for spaying your dog is a decrease in mammary tumors. So initially, studies showed that, and these are studies from like the 60s, that there was a decrease in mammary tumors across the board for dogs that were spayed, and that didn't really matter when it came to the age of the animal and when they were spayed. However, nowadays, more studies are showing that that actually isn't the case, that spaying at a later stage in life isn't really associated all that much with a decrease in mammary tumors. What they're showing is that age is really important. So spaying a dog before their first estrus cycle, so before their first heat, is what really decreases the chances of mammary tumors. So that's one of the strongest pros for spaying your dog when it comes to health. So the second strongest reason to have your animal spayed is the possibility of something called pyometra, and I think that I already briefly mentioned this before. Basically what pyometra is, it's an infection of the uterus by bacteria. So it's pus in the uterus. And this can be a life-threatening condition if it's not addressed right away. It is an emergency situation, and it's extremely common in females that aren't spayed. So I think there's a Swedish study that looked at intact females, and about 24% of intact females within their life developed pyometra at some point. It is something that you can monitor for, so you have to keep watch on your dog, and if you start to see pus coming out of the vulva, that's a really important sign that something really bad is happening and that you need to get your dog into the emergency clinic right away. So of course, by spaying your animal, you significantly reduce that risk because the uterus is no longer there, right? You're taking away that thing. There is the possibility for a very small percentage of animals that are spayed to develop something called stump pyometra, which is basically when that infection takes place when there's like a little tiny piece of the uterus left over after they remove it, and that becomes infected. But that's very rare and it doesn't happen a lot. So you are going to significantly reduce the risk of pyometra in females when you spay your animal. The third obvious reason is, of course, you're reducing the risk of ovarian and uterine cancers. That's pretty simple to understand. You're taking out the ovaries and the uterus, so that kind of cancer is not going to be a risk for your animal anymore. You don't have to worry about that. Some people will be very happy to know that the changes in behavior after a spay are much lower than what you would see in a male. So females are fairly unaffected when it comes to behavior. There are some studies that show that it decreases nesting behaviors, and also females can get something called pseudo-pregnancy, which is basically when they're not pregnant but they think that they are, and there's some aggression that's been associated with that, and so spaying your dog will reduce the amount of aggression that is exhibited during pseudo-pregnancy. There's some other studies that have linked like a decrease in howling and in chewing behaviors with spaying your animal, but those studies are really not supported very well. So I wouldn't say that that's a reason to spay your animal. Also, obviously, I have to put it in as a pro is convenience to the owner. I do want to say, at least personally, my opinion is that someone should never choose to do something to their animal like that, like an invasive surgery, for convenience for themselves, right? I would never decide to spay my animal to avoid having to clean up blood. It has to be for the health of the animal. It has to be what you feel is the best decision for your dog, not for yourself. So obviously, as a pro, I need to mention that it is convenient, but I would not make that the deciding factor in your decision to spay or not to spay your dog. All right, so we've covered the major pros of doing a spay, and now I want to talk to you guys about the cons. I feel like a lot of vets don't talk about the cons. This is a major source of revenue for vet clinics, so I honestly have never heard a vet ever talk about cons in a clinic before, and I think it's really important that we understand the cons that are associated with spaying as well. I'm going to say right away that there is a serious lack of studies to look at the long-term effects of removing those hormones from your animal. It's not something that's been really emphasized in the scientific literature. There's always a source of bias because it's always about what studies get funded, right? So there's certain studies that won't get funded, and then you don't have a lot of information to go off of. Okay, so the first con is something that's really important to consider, and that is urinary incontinence. So this is actually a very common thing to happen to spayed females. So this really isn't well understood at all, why urinary incontinence develops after spaying females, but some studies have pointed towards the possibility that there is a loss of bladder tone. So one study has shown in the United States that when dogs are spayed very early, so for example at 3 months of age, that the chances of developing urinary incontinence afterwards is a lot higher. So it might be associated with early age spays. And then another study showed that it is also associated with weight. So spayed females that were overweight or at a higher weight had a higher chance of developing urinary incontinence. So that's really important to keep in mind for spayed females, is that you might run the risk of having to then manage urinary incontinence in your dog for the rest of their life if they develop that due to the spaying. So the second con is associated with cancers. A lot of people spay to prevent cancer, but there are some studies that show that certain other types of cancer might increase when spaying your animal. So the studies that I've found so far have focused on very specific breeds. Unfortunately, a lot of the literature in vet med tend to focus on very specific breeds, and that tends to be a lot of golden retrievers. So keep in mind that it might be very breed specific, but I'm gonna look at my notes here right now, and so far I've found studies that show that spaying might increase the risk of osteosarcoma, which is cancer of the bone, and that was in certain breeds like Rottweilers, for example. There's also increased risk of hemangiosarcoma and mast cell tumors in golden retrievers spayed later on in life. So that was after 12 months of age. It is understood that estrogen might have a protective effect on preventing certain cancers, but the underlying mechanism is really not well understood at all. So one important thing to remember when we're talking about cancers associated with spays is that in general, across the board, it's been shown that females that are spayed have a longer lifespan than females that are not spayed. So when we're talking about cancers developing because of spaying your dog, it might actually be associated with the fact that animals that are spayed live longer, and so the cancers that we would see more in aged animals are more common in spayed animals, if that makes sense. The next con to keep in mind is the potential for weight gain. So when you're removing these hormones, that's going to affect metabolism, and so it has been shown that with spayed females, they're more prone to gaining weight. That's something that's easily managed by diet, but if it's not managed, then that can lead to certain health risks, right? So the next thing that's really important to consider is joint problems. This is something that a lot of people ask about when it comes to spaying and especially neutering. Not going to touch on the neutering, but let's talk a bit about what we might see with spaying a dog and certain joint problems. So stopping the production of these hormones, especially at an early age, can have an effect on joints for your animal. It can have an effect on the growth plates. And then also, like I just touched upon, it can increase the weight of the animal. And so those two things combined cause joint problems. And so it has been shown that spaying at an early age, so that's less than 12 months of age, has been linked to increased risks of cruciate ligament problems. And that's very common for larger breeds. So this is something that you probably would want to consider if you have a larger breed. Okay, and so then the final thing to consider is, again, behavior. A lot of people wonder if there's any negative behaviors that are associated with spaying an animal. There have been some studies that have been linked to increased fear and anxiety in females that are spayed, but like I said, it's really hard to study behavioral issues in animals, and I wouldn't put too much weight on those studies. So I would never make a decision based off of the effect on behavior alone. So I think the take-home message is that a lot of the emphasis on spaying has been as a population control mechanism, and that's totally fair. It's definitely well known that there's way too many dogs and cats that are in shelters that need homes, and we really don't need to be having unexpected pregnancies in female dogs. However, for the owner that is responsible, I don't think that that is the key deciding factor. I think we really need to know pros and cons when it comes to the health of the animal to be able to decide what we want to do. So obviously spaying a dog at an early age comes with certain pros. You really decrease the chances of mammary tumors, but you also have things that could potentially increase by spaying at that early age, right? You increase the risk of urinary incontinence, for example. You increase the risk of potential joint issues. So those things are all things you're going to have to weigh when you're making a decision. And it's a very personal decision with you and your pet. And I hope that this video can give you a little bit more background to make that decision for yourself. So thank you so much for joining me today, and I will see you guys very soon in another video. Take care.